He was supposed to marry her, not save her. Kaelen Ashvane had knelt across from 100 strangers in that cathedral, prepared to do his duty the way every Dragon King before him had, coldly, correctly, without ever once letting himself feel anything for the girl chosen to stand beside him. Then Lyra looked up at him with eyes that held no fear of him, only quiet, devastating honesty, and something in his chest he'd spent his whole life keeping locked simply broke open. He still ordered her execution an hour later. Not because he wanted her dead, because refusing meant losing her anyway, and losing himself with her. She knelt at the altar, waiting for the blade, watching the only man in that kingdom who had ever been honest with her stand frozen, helpless, forced to choose between his crown and his conscience. And when her tears finally fell, not for herself, but for him, the dragon eggs beneath that altar answered her instead. If you love a love story that makes you ache before it lets you breathe, stay close, hit subscribe, and tell me in the comments where in the world you're watching from tonight. Now let's go back to the morning a king was told who to marry and never once asked if his heart had a say. Chapter 1. A crown she never asked for. The kingdom of Ashera measured a person's worth in gold thread and family names, and Lyra had spent 19 years owning neither. She had grown up in the orphanage at the edge of the lower quarter, a building that leaked when it rained and froze when it didn't, raised by a matron who counted bread before she counted kindness. She scrubbed cathedral floors from the age of 12, learned to disappear into doorways when nobles passed, and told herself so many times that love and beauty and gentle things were for other girls that she had almost stopped noticing the ache of believing it. She had never once let herself imagine a man looking at her the way the old ballads described, like she was something worth crossing a kingdom for. Girls like her didn't get ballads. They got chores and cold mornings and the occasional kindness of someone equally poor, like Finn, the stable boy 2 doors down who had spent half his childhood trading her bread scraps for company. So when the royal heralds rode into the lower quarter on a frostbitten morning and read her name aloud as the chosen bride of Kaelen Ashvane, Dragon King of Ashera, Lyra's first feeling wasn't hope. It was dread, sharp and immediate, the particular dread of a girl who has learned that anything good happening to her usually comes with a price someone else decided she'd pay. "You don't have to go," Finn said quietly, once the crowd had thinned and the herald had ridden off to spread the news through the rest of the city. "We could run. I know roads past the eastern farms no soldier bothers to watch." "And go where, Finn? Be who?" Lyra's voice cracked despite her best effort to sound steady. "A girl with nothing doesn't get to disappear. She gets found." He pressed a small, chipped iron coin into her palm, the one they used to flip as children to decide who got the last heel of bread, and said nothing else, because there was nothing else to say to a girl being delivered to a king like a tax payment. The royal carriage that came for her 3 days later was gilded and freezing, its velvet seat stiff with disuse. She rode through streets lined with people who had never once looked at her with anything but contempt, now throwing flower petals at her feet as though she'd been blessed rather than chosen. She kept the coin tucked in her sleeve the entire ride, the one thing in her possession nobody had assigned to her. Sarah, the eldest of the handmaidens given to dress her, was the first person inside the palace walls to speak to Lyra like she mattered, even as her hands trembled over every stitch. It was Sarah who finally told her, gently and with visible guilt, that 7 brides before her had died at that altar, every single one, in ceremonies that always ended the same impossible way. "And they keep choosing brides anyway?" Lyra asked, feeling the floor tilt beneath her feet. "The priests say the eggs demand it," Sarah murmured. "I am sorry, my lady. I should not have told you. But you have a kind face, and I did not want you walking in believing you were the first to hope." That night, alone in a chamber larger than the entire orphanage she'd grown up in, Lyra did not sleep. She sat at the window overlooking the cathedral spire and tried to make peace with a kingdom that called a death sentence a sacred honor. She met Kaelen Ashvane for the first time 2 days before the wedding, in a hall of black marble lit by braziers that never seemed to warm the air. He was younger than she expected, perhaps 5 years older than her, with the kind of handsome, careful face that comes from a lifetime of being taught what to feel rather than feeling it freely. He looked at her the way a man might look at a horse he'd been told to buy but hadn't chosen, and for one bitter second, Lyra braced herself for the same contempt she'd weathered her whole life. It never came. "You're smaller than the others," he said, which was not a greeting. "I didn't know there was a standard size for dying," Lyra answered, before she could stop herself. Something flickered behind his eyes, not anger, not amusement, but something closer to recognition, as if he hadn't expected her to have a voice at all, let alone use it like a blade aimed straight at him. He studied her for a long moment, long enough that she felt the heat of it crawl up the back of her neck, an unfamiliar, unwelcome warmth she didn't have a name for yet. "You've heard the stories then," he said. "Everyone has heard the stories. No one will tell me the truth in them." "The truth," Kaelen said quietly, stepping closer than protocol allowed, close enough that she could see the exhaustion behind his composed expression, "is that I did not choose any of you. The priests choose. I only carry out the ceremony and pray, every single time, that it goes differently." He paused at the door before he left, and for one unguarded moment, his composure cracked just enough to let something tender slip through. "For what it's worth, Lyra of No House, I hope it goes differently this time. I am tired of watching girls die for a promise that was never theirs to keep." It was the first time in her life a man with power over her had looked at her like her death would cost him something, too. She told herself it meant nothing. A king's pity was not affection. But she found herself thinking about the low, careful way he'd said her name more than she wanted to admit, found herself replaying it at night instead of the dreams that had started haunting her. 7 eggs glowing gold beneath an altar, and a voice calling her by a title that wasn't hers. Mother of Ash. She told no one about the dreams. In a kingdom that had already killed 7 brides, anything unusual about her felt like a danger dressed as a gift. In the days leading to the wedding, she was bathed, dressed, instructed, and paraded through rituals that meant nothing to her heart and everything to her fear. She memorized every vow she was meant to recite and forgot none of the dread underneath them. But twice more, she crossed paths with Kaelen in the palace halls, once in the gardens at dusk, where he'd been standing alone watching the last light fade over the mountains, and once in the library, where she'd gone hunting for any record of the 7 brides before her and found him there first, reading the same forbidden histories she was. "You're looking for the same answers I am," she said, startled. "I've been looking for them my whole life," Kaelen admitted, closing the book before she could see its title. "I just never had a reason brave enough to keep looking until now." The way he looked at her then, steady, unguarded, achingly sincere, made something in Lyra's chest twist with a feeling she refused to call hope, because hope, in her experience, was simply grief that hadn't happened yet. "Why does it matter to you?" she asked. "You'll still do your duty either way. You said so yourself." "Duty and conscience aren't always the same animal," Kaelen said, voice low. "I've spent my whole life pretending they were, because it was easier than admitting how much it costs me every time I watch a girl I barely know walk toward an altar that's killed every girl before her. I don't want it to cost me you, Lyra. I just don't yet know how to stop it." They stood like that for a long moment, neither of them moving, the library quiet except for the distant sound of rain beginning against the windows. Lyra was aware, suddenly and uncomfortably, of how close he was standing, of the warmth radiating from him in a way that had nothing to do with the cold stone room around them. She thought of every story she'd ever overheard the older girls whisper at the orphanage about kings and princes, stories that always ended with the poor girl either crowned or buried, and wondered, with a strange lurch of feeling, which ending was waiting for her. "You shouldn't say things like that to me," she said finally, taking a careful step back. "It isn't fair. Not when I might be dead by the end of the week." "You're right," Kaelen admitted, and something in his voice sounded almost relieved to have it named aloud. "It isn't fair to either of us. But I find I would rather be unfair to myself than pretend I feel nothing, when feeling nothing has never once come easily where you're concerned." The rehearsal for the ceremony came 2 days later, conducted in the same cathedral that would host the wedding itself, the 7 dragon eggs sealed beneath their glass dome at the altar's center, dormant and indifferent to the 2 people practicing vows they weren't certain either of them would survive to keep. Kaelen recited his lines with the flat precision of a man who had memorized them out of necessity rather than belief, until the priest overseeing the rehearsal stepped away to consult a scroll, and the 2 of them were left alone for the length of a single held breath. "If I had been allowed to choose," Kaelen said quietly, not looking at her, his eyes fixed instead on the dormant eggs, "I think I would have chosen someone exactly like you. Someone who tells me the truth instead of what she thinks a king wants to hear." "You don't know me well enough to know that," Lyra said, though her voice had lost its earlier sharpness. "I know that you looked me in the eye the first time we met and told me you didn't know there was a standard size for dying," he said, finally turning to face her, something soft and unguarded breaking through the careful composure he wore like armor everywhere else in this palace. "I have been surrounded by people who flatter me my whole life, Lyra. I have never once been surrounded by someone who simply refused to be afraid of me. I find I don't want to lose that, whatever else this week brings." She didn't have an answer for that, not one she trusted herself to say aloud without her voice breaking, so she said nothing at all, and let the silence between them carry something neither of them was ready to call by its true name. On the morning of the wedding, High Priest Marin came to her chamber alone, his red and black vestments dragging like a bloodstain across the marble floor. "Do you know why the eggs have never woken?" he asked, without preamble. "No," Lyra admitted. "I was hoping you might." Marin smiled, and it didn't reach his eyes. "Because true devotion is rare, child. And the eggs can tell the difference between a girl who fears dying and a girl who has finally found something worth living for." He tilted her chin upward with 2 cold fingers, studying her like a jeweler weighing a stone he already suspected was flawed. "Today, we will find out which one you are." He left without another word, and Lyra sat alone in her wedding gown, hands trembling, with the growing, terrible certainty that whatever was coming at that altar, it was going to cost her more than her life. It was going to cost her the one honest thing she'd found in this entire gilded, suffocating palace, just when she'd finally let herself believe it might be real. Chapter 2: Vows and Verdicts. The cathedral had been built to make ordinary people feel small, and on the morning of her wedding, it succeeded perfectly on Lyra, except for the single, steadying thought that the man waiting for her at the altar had told her, 2 nights before, that he didn't want to lose her. She walked the aisle alone. An orphan had no father to give her away, past 300 nobles in furs and jewels, none of whom had ever looked at her with anything but contempt until a herald scroll made her worth watching. She kept her eyes on Kaelen, standing rigid in ceremonial black and gold, and for one brief, breathless moment, his careful composure slipped just enough to let her see the same fear she carried, dressed up as devotion. The 7 dragon eggs waited beneath their glass dome at the altar's heart, gray shells veined with dormant gold, runes carved into their surface in a language no living scholar could read. They did not look like eggs waiting to hatch. They looked like vaults holding their breath. She had been escorted to the cathedral's outer chamber an hour before, where Sarah laced the final stays of her gown with hands that would not stop shaking. Through a narrow window, Lyra had watched the noble carriages arrive, gold filigree and matched horses, Women in furs worth more than the entire orphanage she'd grown up in, and had pressed Finn's chipped coin into the lining of her sleeve one last time. A small, stubborn act of defiance against a mourning design to strip her of everything that had ever truly belonged to her. "You look like you're walking to your own funeral instead of your wedding," Sarah had whispered, fussing with a final pin. "Maybe I am," Lyra had answered, and the words had felt less like a joke than either of them wanted to admit. The ceremony unfolded exactly as Sarah had rehearsed it. Vows in the old tongue. Oil traced across her forehead in the shape of a flame. A ceremonial blade drawn across her palms so 3 drops of blood could fall onto the glass dome, sealing bride to crown. Her blood hit the glass. Nothing happened. The shift in the room was instant. 300 held breaths sharpening into something closer to dread, High Priest Marin's face going the color of old parchment. Somewhere in the front pews, a noble woman whispered to her husband loudly enough to carry, just like the others, and the words rippled backward through the crowd like a stone dropped into still water. Lyra looked up at Kaelen, and for one terrible, intimate second, something passed between them that had nothing to do with the ceremony and everything to do with the 2 nights they'd spent quietly falling toward each other in libraries and gardens no one else had witnessed. "I'm sorry," his eyes seemed to say. "I don't know how to stop this." "Continue the rite," Marin said, voice gone flat and clinical. What happened next veered violently off the script Lyra had memorized. "By the law of the First Covenant," Marin intoned, raising both arms so his sleeves fell back like wings. "A bride who fails to wake the sacred eggs is no bride at all, but a false vessel, and a false vessel cannot be permitted to wear the crown of Asherah. The eggs have rejected her." "That is not," Kaelen started, stepping forward, but 2 temple guards flanked him, hands on their hilts, and he stopped, jaw tight, eyes burning with a fury he could not act on. Lyra watched him fight a battle no one else in that cathedral could see. The king's duty against the man who, 2 nights ago in an empty library, had told her he would rather be unfair to himself than pretend he felt nothing where she was concerned. "She has insulted the dragon line with her unworthiness," Marin continued, and the crowd, trained for 3 centuries to follow the priesthood's lead, began to murmur its agreement. "The first covenant is clear. A false bride must be returned to the eggs in death, so her failure does not poison the next attempt." Lyra felt the world narrow to a single, impossible sentence. "Return to the eggs in death." "You're going to kill me," she said, voice somehow steady despite her shaking hands, "because I failed to do something none of the other 7 could do either." 7 women understood their duty, Marin said, not unkindly, which somehow made it worse. "I had hoped you would have the same grace." "Grace," Lyra repeated, and for the first time in her short, hard life, something hotter than fear rose beneath the terror. "You mean silence. You mean dying quietly so no one asks why the eggs have never once woken in 300 years of murdering brides." A ripple of discomfort moved through the crowd. Not support, not yet, but the particular unease of people hearing a truth they'd spent generations agreeing not to say. Marin's eyes went colder, harder, more final. He turned to Kaelen. "Your Majesty, the law requires the king's hand, or the king's word, to carry out the sentence." Lyra watched Kaelen's face more closely than she had ever watched anything in her life. She saw him calculate the soldiers, the priests, the nobility, the entire architecture of a kingdom built to crush anyone who tried to bend its rules, even its own king. She saw him understand, in real time, that refusing this order would mean they both died, and the next bride would inherit the exact same trap. What she didn't expect was for him to step closer to her first, close enough that only she could hear him, his voice breaking on words meant for no one else in that cathedral. "I am not choosing this," Kaelen whispered, his hand brushing hers for one stolen second before the guards pulled him back to his place. Whatever happens next, I need you to know that. I would burn this whole crown to the ground before I'd choose it over you, if burning it meant either of us survived the day. It doesn't. So I have to ask you to trust me with something I haven't earned yet, the chance to undo this, even if I can't stop it today. Trust is a strange thing to ask for from a man about to hand me to an executioner, Lyra whispered back, and despite everything, despite the soldiers and the priests and the 300 watching eyes, something in her voice softened even as it shook. But I find I want to give it to you anyway. I think that frightens me more than the blade does. It frightens me too, Kaelen admitted, so quietly only she could hear it. I have spent my entire life being told exactly what to feel and when to feel it, and I have never once been afraid of losing something the way I am afraid of losing you right now, before I even had the chance to call it mine. A guard's hand closed over his shoulder, pulling him firmly back into place, and the moment broke as quickly as it had opened, leaving only the echo of his voice and the ghost warmth of his fingers against hers. Do it, Kaelen finally said aloud, voice cracking on the second word. Carry out the sentence. It was, Lyra would understand only much later, the single act of devastating mercy disguised as cruelty that saved both their lives. A king who fought the priesthood openly that day would have been removed from the throne by sundown, and a dead king could protect no one, least of all her. But in the moment, all Lyra felt was the floor of the world falling away, betrayal so total it didn't even register as betrayal, only confirmation of the oldest, cruelest lesson her whole life had taught her, that wanting something good was always, eventually, a mistake. The temple guards seized her arms and dragged her back to the altar, her wedding gown tearing at the hem, slippers scraping against stone. She was forced to her knees directly before the glass dome, the crowd watching in a silence thick with morbid anticipation. Somewhere behind her, Sarah's voice broke into a single sob before someone silenced it. The executioner stepped forward, blade already drawn. High Priest Marin began the death prayer. Ash returns to ash. Flame returns to flame. The false vessel is unmade, that the true vessel may yet come. While Lyra knelt in the wreckage of her own wedding gown, blood drying on her palm, and looked not at the blade, not at the priest, but at Kaelen, frozen and gray-faced at the edge of her vision, his hand still curled at his side, as though it remembered the warmth of hers. She thought, in that final suspended second, of his voice in the library, low and unguarded. I have never once been surrounded by someone who simply refused to be afraid of me. She thought it was a strange thing to grieve at the very end. Not the crown she'd never wanted, not the marriage that had barely begun, but the unfinished, impossible feeling of being wanted by someone for exactly who she was, cut short before either of them had the chance to find out what it could have become. She thought, too, of Finn's coin tucked against her wrist, of old Hannah's basin of dirty water, of every small, unremarkable thing she had never gotten to finish being, and found, strangely, that it was the thought of Kaelen's hand brushing hers that hurt the most to leave unfinished. If this is the only thing I get, she thought, then let it be enough that he meant it. Across the altar, Kaelen's jaw was clenched so tightly she could see the muscle working beneath his skin, his hands curled into fists at his sides, every instinct in his body screaming at him to cross the distance between them, and every law of his kingdom holding him exactly where he stood. She would learn, much later, that he had spent that entire suspended moment counting the soldiers between himself and the altar, calculating, uselessly, desperately, whether there was any version of the next 10 seconds that ended with both of them still breathing. There wasn't. He knew there wasn't. And the not knowing of what to do with that helplessness was, he would tell her afterward, the closest he had ever come to understanding what it meant to lose something before it was even his to keep. The executioner raised his blade. The crowd held its breath. And one tear, just one, hot and unbidden, The first she had allowed herself since the herald scroll had upended her entire life, slipped down her cheek, fell from her chin, and landed on the shell of the egg closest to her knee. It didn't hatch. It glowed, and then, one by one, with a sound like a held breath finally released, all 7 eggs answered, gold light flooding the glass dome and climbing the cathedral's black pillars, while High Priest Marin stood frozen at the altar with an expression that had nothing to do with joy. Chapter 3. What the Eggs Remembered. The light did not fade. It grew. Lyra knelt frozen at the center of it, the executioner's blade still raised above her, forgotten, as gold radiance poured from all 7 eggs at once and climbed the cathedral's black pillars like vines made of fire. The nobles in the front pews scrambled backward, silk gowns tearing, jeweled hands clutching jeweled throats, while the temple guards who had dragged Lyra to the altar stood paralyzed, unable to decide whether the sentence they'd carried out was now treason against something far older than the throne. Kaelen was the first to move. He crossed the distance between them before anyone could stop him, dropping to his knees beside Lyra at the foot of the altar, his hand finding hers in the chaos and holding on as though he intended never to let go again. Law and ceremony and 300 watching nobles be damned. "I'm here," he said, low and fierce, the first unguarded thing he'd allowed himself to say aloud since the wedding began. "Whatever this is, you are not facing it alone. Not anymore." "Stop this," Marin commanded, though his voice had lost all its earlier theater, replaced by something closer to panic. "Priests, begin the silencing right now." But it was already too late. The light coalesced above the altar into shapes, not solid, not quite ghost, somewhere between memory and vision. The crowd that moments ago had been baying for Lyra's death now stared upward in collective, helpless awe as the first image took form. A woman, enormous even in memory, her body more dragon than human, scaled and crowned, wings folded like a cloak of starlight behind her. She stood atop a mountain Lyra somehow knew was the very one Ashara's palace had been built upon, while smaller figures knelt around her in robes belonging to the first Ashvane king. "That is Ignara," a noble woman near the front whispered, her voice trembling with recognition rather than confusion. "The Dragon Queen of the old hymns. I thought she was a myth." Near the cathedral's side aisle, a knight in black scale armor etched with gold, one of the last members of the ancient Dragon Knight Order, sworn since the founding to guard the eggs they had never been told the whole truth about, sank slowly to one knee, his gauntlet hand pressed flat against his chest, as though something buried in his own blood had finally recognized its source. Lyra would learn his name later, Ser Dalric, and would learn too that his bloodline had whispered half-forgotten stories for generations about a debt owed to a queen no one alive had ever seen. The vision shifted. The first Ashvane king, young and golden-haired, approached the Dragon Queen not as a supplicant, but as an ally. Words passed between them that the vision didn't give sound to, but their meaning was unmistakable in the warmth of the gestures, the way Ignara lowered her enormous head to let the king rest a hand against her scales. A third light, a fourth. The visions came faster now, overlapping, urgent, as though the eggs understood they might only have moments before the priesthood found a way to silence them. Lyra saw chains forged of something that glowed the same sickly red as the priest's robes. She saw the treaty feast itself, tables groaning under tribute the young king had promised to honor an alliance Ignara had trusted enough to lower her guard for. She saw Ignara, proud, magnificent Ignara, brought low not by a war she lost, but by a poison slipped into that very feast, by chains laid across her while she slept the deep, trusting sleep of an ally among friends who had already decided, behind closed doors and candlelight, that her gold and her bones were worth more than her friendship would ever be. The Dragon Queen was betrayed. A young noble said, too loudly, his voice cracking with a particular vertigo of watching 300 years of national pride dissolve in real time. "Silence him," Marin snapped, but his voice had no authority left in it. Beside her, Lyra felt Kaelen's grip on her hand tighten, his whole body gone rigid with a horror that had nothing to do with fear for himself. "This is what we built our crown on," he said, almost to himself, the words coming out broken in a way she hadn't heard from him before, not even at the altar. "All of it. Every gold thread in this cathedral. I asked you to trust me with a chance to undo something, and I didn't even know yet what it was I was promising to undo." "You know now," Lyra said quietly, her own fingers curling tighter around his. "That has to count for something." The fifth egg's light showed the cathedral itself, or rather, its foundations, the same black marble altar Lyra knelt before now, being built directly over a chamber sealed in chains of that same sickly red light. Lyra felt her stomach turn over as she understood, with dream clarity, exactly what that chamber held. Not a tomb. A prison. Ignara had not died in that ancient betrayal. She had been imprisoned, kept alive, kept dormant, directly beneath the very altar 300 years of Ashvane kings had used to perform their sacred ceremonies, directly beneath the very spot where 7 brides before Lyra had knelt and died. The sixth egg's vision answered the question no one in that cathedral had wanted to ask aloud. Why did the eggs never hatch? Because they were never meant to. The light showed Ignara, chained in her hidden chamber, gathering what magic she had left, not to escape, not to wake, but to preserve. Lyra watched the dragon queen press 7 scales from her own body into 7 hollow shells, sealing within each one not an unborn dragon, but a fragment of memory, a piece of testimony, a witness that could not be silenced by chains or centuries or priesthoods. "They're not dragons," Lyra whispered, her own voice thick with a grief that wasn't entirely her own. "They're evidence." The 7th egg's light was the smallest, the gentlest, and somehow the most devastating. It showed Ignara alone in the dark beneath the altar, her enormous eyes open in the gloom, fixed upward toward the ceremony she could no doubt hear muffled through 300 years of stone, and from her throat came a single word, repeated like a vow she refused to let herself forget, even in 3 centuries of captivity. "Daughter." Lyra felt that single word land somewhere beneath her ribs, in a place she had never had reason to name before, because nothing in her short, hard life had ever once called her wanted. She had been an orphan, a kitchen girl, a bride no one chose for love, a condemned woman kneeling for execution, but never, not once, had anything in this world looked at her and called her daughter with that particular ache of 300 years of waiting behind it. She found Kaelen watching her with an expression that held no fear of what she might be, only a fierce, unguarded tenderness, as though whatever she turned out to be, he had already decided it didn't change a single thing about how he felt. "Whatever you are," he murmured, low enough that it felt like it belonged only to the two of them even amid the chaos, "you are still the woman who looked me in the eye and refused to be afraid of me. That hasn't changed. I don't think it ever will." The light dimmed, gathering instead into a final shape hovering directly above Lyra's upturned face, a voice that did not come from any single egg but from all 7 at once, resonant in a way that made the very stone of the cathedral hum. "Mother of Ash, blood of the old covenant. We have waited 300 years for someone with the courage to weep at an altar built on our queen's chains, instead of bowing to it." 2 priests lunged forward with ceremonial hammers raised, aiming for the glass dome, and Kaelen rose to his feet in front of Lyra without releasing her hand, his sword drawn in the other, his voice cutting through the chaos with a fury she had not known he possessed. "No one touches them," Kaelen roared, "until I understand exactly what my family has done, and no one touches her, either, while I am still breathing." Ser Dalric was the one who moved next, rising from his kneeling position near the side aisle and stepping between the priests and their hammers, his own gauntlet hand raised, not in challenge, but in something closer to an oath finally being honored after 300 years of forgetting why it had ever been sworn. The Dragon Knight Order was founded to protect the eggs, Dowrick said, his voice carrying through the chaos with the flat, unshakable calm of a man who had spent his entire life waiting, without knowing it, for this exact moment. Not the throne that built an altar over them. Not the priests who used them to frighten brides into silence. If that truth condemns this kingdom's founders, then so be it. We did not swear our oath to a lie, and we will not lift a hand against the woman they were waiting 300 years to find. Behind him, the remaining knights of his order began moving, forming a slow, deliberate wall between the hammers and the 7 shells that had finally, after 3 centuries, found their voice, and between the priesthood and the king who had just sworn, in front of his entire kingdom, that he would rather die defending a kitchen maid than rule another day over her grave. Chapter 4. Mother of Ash. The cathedral that had gathered to watch Lyra die was now a battlefield of loyalties no one had chosen, and no one knew how to navigate. Kaelen stood with his sword raised between the altar and the 2 priests who had moved to destroy it, Lyra still close enough behind him that she could feel the tension radiating through his back. The careful king she'd met in a marble hall 2 weeks ago now finally gone, replaced by a man who had decided, somewhere between the altar and this moment, exactly what mattered to him most. Your Majesty, you do not understand what you are protecting, High Priest Marin said, real fear cracking through his voice now. If the kingdom believes the Ashvane line stole their throne from a betrayed dragon queen, there will be no throne left to inherit. Riots.
Va.
The noble houses will tear each other apart fighting over who gets to be innocent. And if I destroy the only proof of a crime my ancestors committed, Kaelen answered, voice low but carrying, what does that make me, except the 8th generation to choose the lie over the truth, and the first to choose it after I'd already promised someone I loved that I wouldn't. The word loved landed in the cathedral like a struck bell, and Lyra felt her own breath catch because he hadn't whispered it this time, hadn't meant it only for her. He had said it in front of his entire kingdom, in front of the priesthood and the nobility and the dragon-shaped truth still glowing above them, as though it were simply a fact too large and too necessary to keep hidden any longer alongside everything else this day had already exposed. Marin's eyes flicked to Lyra, kneeling no longer. She had risen at some point without realizing it, Kaelen's hand still loosely linked with hers. She is not what you think she is, Your Majesty. A bloodline buried for 300 years does not simply walk back into the world wearing a kitchen maid's calluses. This is manipulation. It means exactly what it showed us, Lyra said, surprised again by how steady her voice came out. It means your kingdom did not save a dying species. It conquered one, and built 300 years of worship on top of her grave to make sure no one ever asked where the gold in your treasury actually came from. A murmur went through the surviving crowd, those who hadn't fled the cathedral the moment the visions began, and this time it did not sound like fear of Lyra. It sounded, distantly, dangerously, like the beginning of fury directed somewhere else entirely. It was at that moment that the cathedral's great doors were thrown open, and the chamber's chaos found a new, far more immediate problem. Outside, the sky had gone the color of a bruise, lit by a vast pale shape descending through the cathedral's broken spirelight. The white dragon Lyra had only seen in fragments of the egg's memories now made achingly, terrifyingly real, chains of red-gold light still wrapped around its throat and wings even as it broke free of whatever had bound it 300 feet beneath the palace stone. Ignara had woken. Soldiers in black dragon-scale armor poured into the cathedral square, led by a hard-eyed commander Lyra had seen once before, standing silent at the edge of her wedding rehearsal 3 days earlier. General Vexer. The prisoner beneath the palace has broken containment, Vexer reported, voice clipped and disciplined even as his eyes betrayed real terror at the dragon visible through the cathedral's shattered windows. There is no prisoner, Kaelen interrupted, his voice shaking now, the full weight of what he'd just witnessed finally landing somewhere it couldn't be deflected. He had not let go of Lyra's hand once, even as he turned to face his own general. There is a dragon queen my family chained beneath our own palace for 300 years, and I am done pretending otherwise, even if it costs me this crown. Ignara's vast form circled once above the cathedral square, wings beating air thick with smoke and panic, and when she finally descended to the broken courtyard stones, the crowd that hadn't already fled scattered like leaves before a storm. Up close, she was even more overwhelming than the egg's memories had shown. Scales the white of old bone, eyes like molten gold, chains still scorched and humming around her throat and forelegs. Where her claws struck stone, the courtyard cracked in spiderweb patterns 3 centuries of careful masonry had never been built to withstand, and the few remaining temple guards who hadn't already fled simply dropped their weapons where they stood. She did not breathe fire. She did not need to. Her presence alone was enough to bring 300 years of carefully maintained order to its knees. Ser Dalric was the first to move toward her rather than away, his orders knights fanning out behind him not as a threat, but as an honor guard, the old oath finally finding the queen it had been sworn to protect. He knelt at the edge of the broken courtyard, helm removed, and said nothing at all, because, he would tell Lyra much later, there had been nothing in 300 years of training that prepared a man for finally standing in front of the thing his entire bloodline had been quietly mourning without knowing her name. Daughter. The voice came again, not from the eggs this time, but from the dragon herself, resonant inside Lyra's skull rather than spoken aloud. You wept where I could not. You woke what I could not free myself. I'm not your daughter, Lyra said aloud, though her voice cracked on it. I was an orphan in a kitchen yesterday. I don't even know what to do with a crown, let alone a bloodline. Blood does not require memory to be true. Ignara's massive head lowered, gold eyes fixing on her with an intensity that made the remaining nobles drop to their knees out of sheer instinct. Your line descended from those who stood with me before the betrayal, my own kin among humans, bonded to my flame by oath rather than blood, hidden when the Ashvane crown began, hunting down anyone who remembered the truth. They scattered your ancestors into the lowest, most forgotten corners of this kingdom precisely, so no one would think to look for them there. It worked for 300 years, until a king finally found something worth losing his crown over. Kaelen's hand tightened around Lyra's at that, and when she glanced up at him, she found him already looking at her. Something unguarded and certain settled into his expression, as though Ignara had simply confirmed out loud what he'd already decided the moment he'd knelt beside her at the altar. Why me? Lyra pressed, her voice unsteady now in a way it hadn't been even with a blade above her throat. Why not one of the 7 brides before me? Because they were not asked to weep for a kingdom that wronged them, Ignara answered, something in her vast golden eyes softening just enough for Lyra to see the grief beneath 3 centuries of fury. They were asked to weep for themselves, frightened girls dying for a crown that never loved them. You wept for truth, and you let yourself be loved in return, daughter, on a day designed to make you believe you were unworthy of it. That is not blood. That is choice. And choice, in the end, is the only inheritance that has ever mattered to my kind. Marin, still standing near the altar with his ceremonial hammer abandoned at his feet, found his voice one last time, though it came out smaller than it had all morning. If this is true, if the old bloodline has truly returned, then the entire foundation of the priesthood's authority over the sacred eggs is a fabrication we built to control a kingdom we never had any right to control. Yes, Lyra said simply, no triumph in it, only exhaustion. General Vexor's soldiers stood frozen between two impossible orders: protect the crown or protect the truth, and for a long, suspended moment, the entire kingdom seemed to hang on what happened next. Vexor himself had not lowered his sword, though his eyes moved between Ignara's massive, scorched form and his king kneeling unarmed before her, weighing 2 decades of loyalty to a throne against the plain, undeniable evidence of what that throne had been hiding beneath its own foundations, and the unmistakable sight of his king choosing a woman over his own crown in front of the entire surviving nobility. He had served 3 Ashvane kings. He had never once been asked to choose between the crown and the truth, because no one before today had ever forced the two apart loudly enough for a soldier to notice the gap between them. Then Kaelen released Lyra's hand, walked past the frozen priests and the trembling nobility, and knelt, not before the altar his family had built on stolen ground, but before Ignara herself, the dragon queen his bloodline had betrayed and imprisoned for 300 years. "I cannot undo what my ancestors did," he said, loud enough for the entire square to hear. "But I will not spend my reign protecting their lie, and I will not spend another day pretending the woman beside me is anything less than the reason I finally found the courage to say so. Whatever happens to my crown after today, I am done choosing the throne over what's right, and done choosing it over her." Ignara's gold eyes studied him for a long, terrible moment, weighing 300 years of betrayal against one king's willingness to kneel for love and truth in the same breath. "Pretty words," she said at last, "from a bloodline that has only ever offered me pretty words before. Show me they mean something, Dragon King. Free what remains of my kin, dismantle the lie your family built over my chains, and love my daughter without flinching from what she is, and perhaps your line will be allowed to exist alongside mine instead of beneath my fire." Behind them, Marin's hand moved, too quickly, too desperately, towards something hidden in his vestments, a final, fanatic attempt to salvage 3 centuries of priestly power before it slipped entirely beyond his control, and Lyra, watching him with the sharpened instincts of a girl who had spent her whole life learning to read danger before it landed, was already moving to warn Kaelen before anyone else in that shattered cathedral even understood what was about to happen. Chapter 5. A Queen Worth Burning For. What Marin drew from his vestments was not a blade. It was a shard of the same sickly red-gold material that had formed Ignara's chains, small, no larger than a dagger, but humming with the same foul, light-drinking resonance Lyra had seen wrapped around the Dragon Queen in the egg's memories. A focus stone, the priesthood's last reserve of the binding magic that had kept a Dragon Queen dormant beneath their altar for 300 years, small enough to be hidden, strong enough, in the right hands, to do considerable damage to anyone it touched. "If the old covenant returns," Marin said, voice raw with the particular desperation of a man watching his entire purpose dissolve in real time, "then everything I have devoted my life to is a lie I helped maintain. I would rather end this here than live inside that truth." He lunged, not at Ignara, who could have ended him with a single breath, but at Lyra, the one piece of the unfolding catastrophe still small enough, still human enough, for a desperate man to believe he could stop. "Kaelen!" Lyra's voice tore out of her before she could think, but she didn't need to call his name twice. He was already moving, the same instinct that had carried him across a cathedral floor to kneel beside her at the altar, now carrying him between her and the blade, without a single second of hesitation, as though some part of him had simply decided, long before this moment, that there was no version of his life he wanted that didn't have her safely inside it. The focused stone caught his forearm instead of her throat, a line of fire opening across his skin that he didn't so much as flinch from, too focused on driving his own sword into Marin's side before the old priest could strike a second time. Marin fell at the foot of the altar he had spent his whole life defending, the focused stone clattering from his hand and shattering against the cathedral stones, its sickly light finally, fully extinguished. Kaelen. Lyra was at his side instantly, both hands pressed against the wound on his arm, her voice breaking in a way it hadn't even at the altar with the blade above her own throat. "You weren't supposed to. I was the one they wanted, you didn't have to." "I told you," Kaelen said, breath uneven but his eyes steady on hers, something almost like relief breaking through the pain. "I would rather be unfair to myself than pretend I felt nothing where you're concerned. That hasn't changed just because someone tried to make it cost me something." Ignara's chains, still wrapped loose and scorched around her throat and forelegs, dissolved into ash the instant the stone broke, the last thread of 300-year-old magic finally severed completely. The Dragon Queen rose to her full, terrible height, wings spreading until they brushed the cathedral's shattered ceiling, and for one long moment, every soldier, noble, and priest still standing in that square braced for the violence 3 centuries of imprisonment had surely earned the right to deliver. It did not come. Instead, Ignara lowered her head toward the two of them, where Lyra knelt pressing a torn strip of Kaelen's own ceremonial robe against his wound, and exhaled, not fire, but something warmer, something that felt less like flame and more like the first sunlight after an impossibly long winter. The cut on Kaelen's arm closed beneath it, leaving only a thin silver scar in a shape disturbingly similar to the runes carved into the 7 eggs. "You bled for someone who is not even of my blood," Ignara said to him, and her voice, for the first time since she'd broken free of the palace's depths, carried something almost like wonder instead of fury. "Perhaps that is the truest test of whether your crown deserves to survive this day. Not whether you can rule a kingdom, but whether you would give up your own blood to protect the one person it never occurred to you to weigh against it." "I never had to weigh it," Kaelen said, his hand finding Lyra's again, lacing their fingers together with a certainty that had nothing left to hide behind. "There was never a version of this where I chose anything over her. I simply hadn't said it loudly enough yet." The days that followed Marin's death and Ignara's freedom were not gentle ones. News of what had happened in the cathedral spread through Ashera faster than any royal decree ever had. The noble houses split immediately into factions, some clinging desperately to the old order, insisting the visions had been dragon trickery. Others, particularly among the common quarters where Lyra herself had grown up, seizing on the truth with the specific, righteous fury of people who had always suspected the kingdom's gold was built on something rotten and finally had proof. It was not a clean reckoning. Some noble houses fled the kingdom entirely rather than face what their ancestors' wealth had actually been built on. Riots flared in 3 cities before General Vexer, who had, in the end, chosen to stand with Kaelen rather than the old order, managed to redirect the military's loyalty toward protecting the truth-telling rather than suppressing it. The temple itself was dissolved within the month, its remaining priests scattered or, in a handful of cases, arrested for crimes that went back generations. Ser Dalric and the surviving Dragon Knight Order took up a new charge in the temple's place, sworn now not to guard a relic, but to make certain no kingdom ever again built a throne over a buried truth, without someone left alive to remember it. Vexer himself came to Kaelen privately, a week after the cathedral fell quiet, and knelt in a gesture that owed nothing to ceremony. "I drew my sword against you for half an hour that day, Your Majesty, weighing an oath I'd sworn against a truth I couldn't deny. I should have known the moment I saw you cross that altar floor for her which oath actually meant something to you." "It cost me nothing to choose her," Kaelen said, raising the general back to his feet. "It would have cost me everything to choose anything else." Kaelen did not hide from any of it, and he did not hide what he felt for Lyra either. In the weeks that followed, he stood before the surviving noble council and opened the palace's oldest vaults, sealed since the betrayal, letting independent scholars examine exactly what had been hidden there. He also, with a directness that left half the council scandalized and the other half quietly delighted, informed them that whatever became of his crown, he intended to marry Lyra of no house properly this time, not as a sacrifice to an ancient covenant, but as a man choosing the one person who had never once asked him to be anything other than honest. "You don't have to make that decision today," Lyra told him, half laughing despite the exhaustion of the last weeks, as they stood together in the palace gardens where he'd once watched the sunset alone before he'd had a reason brave enough to share it. "We've barely had a wedding that didn't end in an execution order." "Then let's have one that doesn't," Kaelen said simply, and the look on his face left no room for her to argue, even if she'd wanted to. Sarah found Lyra in those same gardens a few days later, still in her plain handmaiden's dress, wringing her hands the way she always did before saying something she was afraid to say. "I should have told you everything I knew, my lady. I was a coward. You told me enough to keep me from walking in blind," Lyra said. "And you were the only person in this palace who looked at me like I mattered before I had any reason to think I did." Finn arrived a week later, having walked the entire distance from the lower quarter, and stood at the palace gates refusing to leave until someone let him see for himself that the girl who'd once traded him bread for stable work hadn't been swallowed whole by a crown she never asked for. When Lyra came to the gate herself, hand in hand with the Dragon King, Finn simply held up the matching half of the chipped iron coin he'd kept all those years, and grinned. "Looks like the gutter's luck finally turned," he said. "Took it long enough." Lyra, through all of it, found herself in the strange, vertiginous position of being neither fully human noble nor fully dragonkin, neither prisoner nor queen, standing in the space between two peoples who had spent 300 years defined entirely by the lie that separated them, and, for the first time in her life, standing there with someone who had chosen her, plainly and completely, before either of them had any reason left to pretend otherwise. "They were never going to hatch into dragons," Lyra said to Kaelen one evening, both of them sitting on the cathedral steps in the long shadow of Ignara's folded wings. "They were always just memory, a mother trying to make sure her story outlived her chains." "And yet they chose you to tell it," Kaelen said, lacing his fingers through hers. "Out of everyone who has knelt at that altar in 300 years, terrified, performing devotion they didn't feel, you were the only one who simply told the truth and wept because it was unbearable, instead of because you were told to. I happened to fall in love with that same woman before I even understood what she was. I'm not sure which one of those was the greater stroke of luck." "Maybe they're the same stroke of luck," Lyra said, leaning into him. "Maybe that's what magic actually is. Refusing to keep performing a lie everyone else has agreed to believe, and finding out someone loves you more, not less for it." Ignara, listening with a patient amusement of a being who had outlived 3 centuries of human philosophy, lowered her great head between them. "The kingdom will need more than memorial stones and dismantled altars, daughter. It will need someone willing to stand between dragon and human and insist, every single day, that neither deserves to rule the other, and a king willing to stand beside her instead of above her." "I don't want their throne," Lyra said. "I never did. I just wanted to stop dying for a lie I didn't write, and somewhere in the middle of nearly dying for it, I found someone worth living for instead." "Then do not take their throne," Ignara said. "Build something new beside it, together, and let the rest of this kingdom learn what it looks like to be loved honestly for the first time in 300 years. A year after the cathedral altar fell stone by stone into a memorial garden, Ashera looked like a kingdom finally learning how to love honestly. Ignara had taken to the mountain peaks above the palace, no longer chained, visible most evenings as a pale shape circling against the sunset. Kaelen ruled with a council that included, for the first time, voices from the lower quarter, and a wife who had never once needed a crown to be worth choosing. Their second wedding was small, held in the same gardens where he'd once told her he hoped this time would go differently.
No altar, no blade.
Only Sarah weeping happily into a handkerchief, Finn grinning at the back row with a chipped coin tucked into his pocket, and a king who said his vows like he meant every single word, because this time, finally, he did. Lyra, mother of Ash, the eggs had called her before they finally went quiet and still, walked beside her husband through both worlds, neither fully throne nor fully flame, proof that the truth and a love built on it could outlast even 300 years of lies. If this story made your heart ache in all the right places, don't let it end here. Subscribe, share it with someone who still believes in love that chooses you on purpose, and tell me in the comments which moment between Lyra and Kaelen hit you hardest. There's another love story waiting for you next. Don't miss it.